Rethinking Poverty and Charity. There are better ways to help the poor and the least of these. I'm Cody Libolt, and I'm talking today with Greg from greenslug.com. That's greenslug with two G's. Tell us about your article that prompted this whole conversation, and then we'll get into discussion between us.
Hey, thanks, Cody. Um, well, basically, I wrote this article because Christians have, there's two things that Christians really care about when it comes to charity. One of these is helping people in economic distress, and the other is spreading the gospel. And this is actually going to be the first of a two-part article series. And so in this one, I wanted to address the question of, hey, what can Christians do to help poor people around the world? And in the article, I open up with, when I was a kid, I used to see this thing on TV called Christian Children's Fund, I think it was. And there was a man with a white beard, and he would say, hey, this kid here is starving, but for 30 cents a day, you can give him food, education, and all of that. And, the kid be looking at the camera, like, pleading, help me. And, like, I remember going to bed as a kid crying, and my mom coming in to console me because I was like, Mom, there's all these starving kids out there. Like, what can we do for them? And I think my mom saw that there was kind of like a weight of the world on me even then, at that age. And, I really cared about, people around the world who were in poverty. And of course, as Christians, we should care because, Jesus does talk about giving to the poor. He talks about, helping people. And of course, for the New Christian Intellectual, we've been talking a lot about the difference between mercy and justice. But we agree with, our intellectual opponents that God does want us to help the poor, even if we don't necessarily agree with all of the philosophy around that. And so I wrote this article to say, hey, what is the best way to help poor people? If we look at this problem and we approach it rationally, what is the best thing we can do? How do we solve the problem of poverty? And from there, I wanted to explain to people, hey, charity is a good thing, and there are good charities out there you can give to. But the only way to raise a nation out of poverty permanently and have it be sustainable is through capitalism.
So giving money to a charitable situation, that will alleviate like a Band-Aid.
Yeah.
Whereas capitalism has relieved poverty in a way that is sustainable. And you have some stats in your article. You said that poverty at the starvation level, if you measure that from the 1970s compared to now, it's been reduced across the world by 80%.
Yes. And I got those stats from Prager University originally, and people can go look at those stats if they want to. But if you ask the average person, like, hey, do you think starvation level poverty has gotten worse in the past 50 years, or do you think it's gotten better? Most people would probably say, oh, I think things are getting worse. I think poverty is getting worse around the world. But actually the opposite is true. So for every 100 people who were starving 50 years ago, you have it where 80% of them are doing a lot better now. And I'm sure that's adjusted for population size and all of that. But we're not seeing the same thing we were seeing, from in the year 1970. I mean, things have gotten so much better economically around the world, and this is amazing news. It's something that's, on the scale of learning about a world war, and yet we're not being told about it. We're not hearing about it, and we should be.
We have to cut between just the rhetoric that says we need this because it will make the world a better place versus the facts.
Yeah. And you'll see a lot with politicians where they want to manipulate people's emotions. They want to say, well, the poor are getting poorer, the rich are getting richer. But that's factually untrue. It's just plain not true. If you look at things on a global scale, it's not true. If you look at things in the United States, it's not true. And if you actually follow families within the United States over the course of decades, you actually see that those families, whether they're poor or rich, are actually getting wealthier. The only reason the stats can be kind of manipulated is because people will say, oh, well, here's poor people in 1970, and here's poor people now. And it's like, well, these aren't the same people. This family in 1970 that was poor, they've gone up on average. And this other family that's poor, a lot of times it's because they just got here. You think of that family that's there's a few Chinese restaurants around here that I like to go to once in a while. And a lot of these are first generation immigrants. You go to the restaurant and the kids are sitting there at the table doing their homework, and the mom and dad are in the kitchen cooking. Those kids, when they grow up, they're probably not going to be in the kitchen cooking. They're going to be doctors and lawyers, and they're going to have a much better future. And of course, I could get onto a tangent that Chinese Americans actually make more money than Caucasian Americans, despite the rhetoric you hear on TV. But I think that's probably a topic for another time.
The idea there is that when you're looking at different variables, you have to be alert to confounding variables. For instance, if the overall levels of immigration increased from one decade to the next, then you would expect that there'd be more poor people, because typically the people that came here have less money. They came here to get more money. So yeah, there's that, and then there's the way households are measured, because there's been a huge demographic change since the 70s due to the increase of divorce and the increase of people living with their parents to a later time period. There's all these different variables where if you look at just one statistic, that doesn't give you the truth. Because like, for instance, a college student who is living with their parents, and the college student is getting a loan to go to school and their parents are assisting them, they might have zero income. That doesn't mean they're living in poverty. So you have to ask yourself the actual facts of the case. And one of the important test cases that you brought up in your article is the nations of North and South Korea. Let's talk about that one.
Yeah. Before we even get into that, not because not to bunny trail too much, but Thomas Sowell, the economist, he actually talks about this quite a bit, where you'll have it where people will say, oh, well, here's these communities, they're low income, therefore they're poor. And he's like, well, wait a minute, some of these communities that are low income, they're right next to one of the world's greatest universities. These are a bunch of poor college students. 5 years from now, these people aren't going to be poor. And in the United States, when you talk about poor people versus rich people, it's generally a difference in age rather than a perpetual income thing. People who, you look at people in 1 year, and they've done studies on this. People were in the bottom 20%. 8 years later, only 3% of people are still in the bottom 20%. So there's so much math that goes on out there, and there's so many ways that people manipulate the statistics. But as you said, North and South Korea. And actually, before that, I sent you a quick quote from the article. Do you have that?
Did you send it over Facebook?
I did. Let me see if I can find it real quick.
Charities can accept an apple from one man and give it to another. Capitalism plants apple trees.
Yeah. So taking a step back, I want to define capitalism. So my thrust with this article is, yes, it's good to give to charity. It's good to do that and help people for today. But if you want to help a nation in the long run, you have to have capitalism. And capitalism is something that's become kind of a bad word in some circles. People will say, well, doesn't capitalism mean that the rich people have all the things and the poor people are their slaves? No. Capitalism is actually a term that means free markets. So if I want to go out in my front yard right now and open up a lemonade stand, I can do that. And I can say, I'm going to sell this lemonade for any price I want, and anybody who wants can come up and have lemonade, or not. They don't have to pay for my lemonade, and I don't have to sell it to them. So free markets means that people are totally free to start a business. They're free to buy and sell, and business is consensual. Whereas in a communist or a socialist context, business is not consensual. You have to help pay for this grain whether you want to or not, or you have to help pay for this health care whether you want to or not. And some people might like that. Some people might, whatever your economic theory is, even if you think that socialized medicine does better, which statistically really isn't holding up, and it's not holding up in a lot of these European countries that have been held up by the left. Whatever your view is on how these things work, these are just basic definitions. Free markets means you are free to go start a business, and the government's not going to persecute you for that. Now, the FDA you might have like an FDA type situation where they say, hey, you can't put rat poison in your lemonade, and that's totally proper. We're not talking about anarchy, so free markets does not mean anarchy, but it does mean that people are free. I don't have to pay $100,000 to the government for a permit to go set up a lemonade stand. And as you talked about North and South Korea, so 70 years ago, and your own Brooke talks about this quite a bit, and honestly, I think your own Brooke explains this better than anybody. 70 years ago, Korea was a very poor country, and they were unified. Then when they were split in half, and you have North Korea, South Korea, North Korea decided to become communist. They decided to become a communist dictatorship where everybody's in it together. It's from each according to his ability to each according to their need. Yay. A perfect leftist utopia. In South Korea, however, they decided to allow free markets, and Westerners came in, built factories, and people went and worked in these factories. And they were a lot of times what we would consider sweatshops. People are only making like $1 a day. But for the people in South Korea, this was a great improvement. They were able to live. They were able to have a life, go to school, do what they needed to do. And that $1 a day became $2 per day, became $5 per day. And gradually their level of income grew. Their ability to create wealth grew. So when they were making that $1 a day, we might say that's unfair. That's taking advantage of them, and maybe it is. But there's a flip side to that. Their labor wouldn't have been worth $5 per day. So if you had given them $5 today, that would have priced them out of the market, because the company still has to pay for shipping, to ship those products back to the West, ship them back to America. And also that person's ability to produce just was not the same as a Westerner's. These are people who probably can't even read. So after all that happened, South Korea became quite wealthy. Now I do have to put a disclaimer out here, because this is not that part is not something I'm an expert in. I'm not an expert in South Korea. So I know about these examples. I've studied them. I have links in the article. So people can read the details a lot more. But I just say that so that somebody doesn't hear me say this and go, oh, it was actually $1.05 per day they were making. You're a big jerk, Greg. Okay, fine. This is just the general overview. This is just a 30,000-foot view of what happened. And so what's the bottom line with this? Skipping past all the specific numbers, apparently you go to Seoul in South Korea today, they're just as wealthy as people in Europe. They're just as wealthy as people in the West. And they're living well. Whereas people in North Korea, it's a giant prison. I've heard stories of people in North Korea like having a green tinge to their skin because they're forced to eat things like grass and bark, because there's no food. There's not enough food out in North Korea. It's an evil dictatorship, and it's not the way to be. It's not the way to live. And granted, somebody might say, oh, well, that's a cherry-picked bad example of communism. But you look at any example of communism or socialism around the world, and historically, they're not good. They don't work out well. In Europe today, people say, oh, here's all these socialist European countries. But the leaders of these countries have responded to the American left and said, actually, no, we're not socialist. And they might have a lot of socialist policies, but they'll have a lower corporate tax rate than here in the United States. So the only way they're able to keep their huge welfare programs going is because they have so much freedom in their markets in order to keep that sustainable. There's a political cartoon where it has a big sign, a neon sign saying European socialism, and somebody pointing to it saying, see, it works. And then behind, you see this little cord going to a generator that said capitalism. So you have capitalism giving the power to make this European socialism work. But back to the article, because I think I've kind of lost focus. You look at places like Africa, you look at South Korea, you look at India, you look at China, you look at Hong Kong. The places that are successful, the places that are rising economically, are the places that are allowing for free markets, are the places where people are investing in business. Other places are not doing well. Places where if you look at Haiti, they have a lot of government regulations, and so people aren't able to properly start a business and do what they need to do to survive. But if you look at Hong Kong's been rated as one of the freest economies in the world. Millions of people from all over Asia have come there for a better life for themselves. Compare Hong Kong to the rest of China, and it's a night and day difference. And nowadays, China is rising economically, but it's only because they've allowed more freedom in their markets. India used to be dirt poor just a few generations ago, and they still are somewhat today. But they're rising economically, and that's because they've allowed international trade, and they've allowed more freedom in their markets. Whereas not long ago, in the 1990s, you couldn't import cars or watches in India. There were huge restrictions on that. I don't know if it was totally outlawed or if it was just like overly taxed or overly regulated, but the end result was the same. So people in the 1990s in India, they had a car equivalent to a 1950s American car. They had watches that were wind up because the government wanted to protect the car and watch industries. But when the government allowed international trade, now people were able to have digital watches. People were able to have a car. Now they're able to get to work on time, because they have a car and a watch. And things are a lot better now than they were back then. And it's kind of funny because when I was a kid, I was always told, oh, China, India, it's overpopulation. People today are told, oh, Africa, it's overpopulation in the poorest parts of Africa. Interestingly, a lot of those poor parts of Africa are very underpopulated. And India and China, they have more people now in both countries than they ever have before. But today, the average Indian or Chinese person is better off than they ever have been in their history because they've allowed free markets. And so I think for the Christian, this translates to a lot of things. I had some suggestions in the article, if we should go into that right now.
Well, one implication is the idea of the fixed pie theory, and you just refuted that. If there's like Malthusian economics from, I guess, what is it, Thomas Malthus? I don't know.
Thomas Malthus.
Malthus.
I think his first name was Thomas. Malthus, and he actually inspired Darwin quite a bit, but even within Malthus's own lifetime, his theory was refuted. So Malthus said, well, people are producing food, but they're also producing more people. So what you're going to have is a situation where people are just going to keep breeding and breeding and breeding, and you're never going to be able to, feed all the mouths. But within his lifetime, even though the population was increasing, the standard of living was also increasing. So Malthus saw this within his own lifetime and was very surprised by it. I don't know if he ever recanted his ideas or not, because I'm not an expert on Malthus. I'm pretty much repeating what I've heard from economists. So that is, my disclaimer. I'm not an economist, but I've read a lot of what economists have to say. And so take what I say with a grain of salt. Don't take this as the gospel according to Greg. But it really does amaze me that it's like, hey, yes, fixed pie. We're always told on TV, we're told by the left, oh yeah, if we have so many people in the world, then everybody gets a smaller piece of the pie. Or the rich are getting this huge piece of the pie, therefore there's less for us. So it's the idea that there's a fixed amount of wealth in the world, and the amount of wealth never increases. But it's just plain not true. People plant more apple trees, and they're able to bake more apple pie. And so it's like the number of apples in the world is not fixed. People are able to use genetic engineering, and I know that's controversial for some people, as well, people should question it somewhat. They should question it rationally, though. They shouldn't have this irrational fear. I remember reading a few years ago about a blueberry plant that was genetically engineered to produce 5 times as many blueberries. People bred apples away from a wild stock to get what we have today, get them to produce more apples. Cows are able to produce more milk now, I'm sure, than 1,000 years ago because people breed the cows to make more milk. So this idea that wealth is fixed is just, it's not true. It fluctuates all the time. I might grow an apple tree and I might eat the apples. Or I might take the apple tree and chop it down and use it for firewood. And I think that was actually something people were forced to do in Atlas Shrugged, if I remember correctly.
So the left, when I see them talking on TV, I saw Ocasio-Cortez talking about how she wanted to tax the top 1%, and they were going to, create this new massive handout to cancel all college debt, and it was going to be to have healthcare paid for everyone. And it was, I don't remember all the numbers off the top of my head, but I think it was like $40 trillion was the estimate. But her plan to tax the wealthy was going to generate $2 trillion. And it was hilarious to watch the interview because the CNN anchor was saying, I don't understand. What is your plan? And her answer was, this is the right thing to do. Now, that brings us to an important fact, and that is that in this discussion, whoever owns the moral narrative is going to win. And so, we have to, as people who advocate free markets, we have to be willing to say the free market is the moral market. There are reasons why it's moral beyond just the fact that it's effective. But we can talk about both because all the facts are on our side, not just some of the facts.
Yeah, and I think that's a huge important point that you bring up. And I had never heard it before I met you, that, hey, you look at socialism or communism or any sort of government-run economy, there's an inherent immorality there because human beings ought to be free. So, I mean, that does kind of open a question saying, hey, even if socialism and capitalism were able to do just as well, you'd still be better off having capitalism. And even if socialism did a bit better than capitalism, you'd still be a lot better off. And I want to make sure I clear up one piece of confusion that I think a lot of people have is they'll hear the word capitalism and they'll think of corporatism. So corporatism is the idea where it's like, hey, you have these giant corporations that run everything. It's kind of what we're having with Google right now. And with some of these other giant, places like Facebook, some of these other giant kind of almost internet monopolies where they're controlling all of the information and they are manipulating people in the government to prevent small businesses from coming in and being able to have competition. So you have kind of this irony that I've been told this happens on both the right and the left, but you have this irony where these huge regulations that are designed to protect the economy and protect the little guy and all that end up just protecting the power of the king in the castle in the business sector. So, and you also hear people say, oh, well, capitalism doesn't work, or capitalism isn't working. And it's like, I remember there was another political cartoon with a man with a tractor, and he's pulling this huge thing behind him up the hill. And it was like some kind of like a train car or something like that. And then you had Barack Obama leaning out going, the little tractor was labeled the free market. And then the big, huge thing behind it was government programs. And this guy is like going up the hill and he's pulling the government programs up with him. And Barack Obama leans out the back of the car and going, see, capitalism isn't working. And it's like, and you saw that in I know we pretend the movie Atlas Shrugged didn't happen, but I was trying to watch it recently, and they had somebody with a big sign saying capitalism isn't working. Meanwhile, you have all of these government overregulations happening. And so it's like, wait a minute, this isn't capitalism. This is something else. This is the government putting this is the government weighing things down. I'm trying to think of a good analogy, but it's like, it's like what, a three-legged race. It's like, our hands are tied behind our backs. So it just doesn't make any sense.
I'll give you an analogy. How about
what?
Atlas?
Oh, with that, yeah.
Atlas
I
is
never
holding
quite
up
got.
the whole earth, but the people of the earth are whipping him and they're torturing him and telling him that he's immoral. And well, Atlas is industry.
Yeah.
And business, and businessmen are a persecuted minority, and they are carrying all of us in a way that we ought to have enormous gratitude and thankfulness. But anyway, so that's a fitting analogy, because the one who's holding up everything is the one that's getting the blame for everything.
Yeah. And I think this kind of brings us to, I know you have to get going in like 5 minutes, but I think this kind of brings me to the whole point of the article, where I talked about, hey, here's these nations that were poor. They allowed free markets, they allowed capitalism, and now they're rising up, they're becoming richer. And in the case of South Korea, they're already as rich as people in the West. So how does a Christian apply this? What does a Christian do with this? And how can we as individual Christians be involved? And in the article, I talked about several organizations. I talked about Kiva being one of them. Kiva is an organization, I don't believe that they were started by Christians, but you can actually loan money to people around the world who are starting businesses. The one downside to Kiva is you don't get any interest from this. So it is interest-free, so you are being charitable. Whereas I would love to see something like that where I get a little bit of interest from the loan, because I'm investing my money. I want, it's good for me to be able to have a return. But I had loaned money to 3 different people using Kiva, and they all paid it back. It was one woman in the Philippines, another woman who I don't know if she was in the Philippines or in another part of Asia, and one man in Africa. Every single one of them paid me back, and they were doing this to start businesses. They needed a loan so they could. In the case of the woman in the Philippines, she was getting more spices and stuff so she could expand her fish business. And right now, with the Philippines having been hit by a huge storm, that's something people can do in addition to giving to charity to help people in the Philippines so they can, get back on their feet. They can also give business loans through Kiva, and so people can get their businesses going again, and so they can have that rise in the economy, so they can metaphorically and physically, possibly, because it's the Philippines, plant apple trees, or perhaps pineapple trees, or whatever kind of fruit grows in the Philippines. And so that is one way, that is one company that Christians can get involved with. Another one is you have different clean water charities out there, and some of those are better than others. So, do your research, but if you give about $30 of a donation, you can give clean water to somebody for their entire life. So now they don't have to walk, 6 hours a day to go get clean water and bring it back to their village. That's something that is very helpful if you want to give to a traditional charity, because then that person doesn't have to spend all that time, and now they can farm, now they can go to school, things like that. I talked about the company Acon started with solar power, where he is going into Africa, and he's selling these little solar power units, which are, I've never been able to find the exact price, but I'm sure they're probably about $20 per unit or something like that. So it's a little tiny solar thing you put on your house. It's like yay big. There's a little cord that comes down, and you can plug things into that cord, and it has a little light bulb on it. So people can have light at night. They can do their homework. They can use an old laptop. There's some great videos out there with Acon doing this. Businesses are able to stay open late. Women don't have to be afraid of walking around in the dark at night. So you don't have to worry about being attacked by maybe a predatory male, or being attacked by a lion. So, just this little tiny bit of electricity has greatly increased the lives of these people. And so as a Christian myself, I have invested in businesses in places around the world like this. And I talk about that more in detail in the article, and I'll add more things in the future. But I think as we go forward in the 21st century, if we want to help people around the world, we have a couple options. We can throw money at the problem. And I'm not saying don't give to charity, because I think we should, and I think we should give to charity rationally. But charity is a Band-Aid. How do we put that exact quote again? Put in simple terms, charities can accept an apple from one man and give it to another. Capitalism plants apple trees. So charity is a Band-Aid. Capitalism is a long-term solution. You want people to rise out of poverty, invest in those places, promote free markets, and help people understand economics, help people to understand that as tempting as socialism and communism can be, especially when things are tough, the best thing people can do is have a free market. And I'll say right off the bat, like, yes, it's not the Garden of Eden. And that's kind of the sick thing you'll see with socialism. They'll say, oh, well, they're still poor people, therefore capitalism isn't working. And it's like, compared to what? The Garden of Eden? It's like, you can't say, well, so communism isn't perfect, therefore let's go have socialism. Because that's just not the way the world works. Yes, the people in South Korea, it took them time to rise in their economic place, but they got there. It took a long time, and I'm sure there are people who, when that first started, who couldn't afford healthcare, who couldn't afford enough food. There were probably people died of poverty initially, but this is the only long-term solution. In the meantime, maybe a bit of charity, but I think the big focus has to be capitalism, has to be Christians being willing to go around the world and support and grow businesses. And I think that they can do that even for themselves too. So this doesn't have to be a quote unquote altruistic thing. This can be a thing where you're investing in business and you're reaping some of the fruit as a result. And that's really the way it should be, because the more fruit you're able to reap, the more fruit you can grow in other places.
Given what we have with the internet, it has never been easier to start a business.
Amen to that.
You can find somebody who needs something from you, and you can do the work, and you can email it to them, or you can do the work on their project electronically in some way. Or you can be the kind of person who gives help using your words. You create wealth by using your words, by showing other people something, how to do something that they want to do. So there's all kinds of opportunities for entrepreneurs right now. And I've experienced how fulfilling it is to employ somebody else as part of my business undertaking, and to realize that I'm making their life better because they got to build something along with me that they didn't know how to build if they had just been by themselves, and nobody would have paid them to do it if they had just been by themselves. But they got to learn, they got to grow, and receive payment to do it. And that is wonderful. As a Christian, if you want to grow your influence, why not grow your influence by equipping other people to provide for themselves by having your own business?
Yeah, I agree. And I think that, to wrap up the video, I think one takeaway I would say is, hey, be willing to think outside the box. In the case of, if you want to help the poor people around the world, one of the best ways you can do that is by helping yourselves. So investment, capitalism, this can go so much farther than charity. And I'm not saying don't give to charity also. But I am saying, hey, if you really want to help the poor, if you really want to help the least of these, the only way that people can rise up out of poverty long-term and have that be sustainable is through capitalism, is through free markets. And like I said, don't be fooled by the left, because it was actually Karl Marx, from what I understand, who coined the term capitalism. And he did this as a derogatory jab against free markets. Honestly, do you really want the guys running the DMV to run your whole life? Probably not. You can see why it doesn't work. You can see why it's immoral, because men ought to be free. And when you help other men to be free, and that includes women and children to be free, you you create a situation where they don't have to rely on a handout. And so I'll say for the people watching this video, go check out my article. Go check out my YouTube channel. Go check out my website. My YouTube channel is youtube.com/greenslug, and slug is spelled with 2 G's. My personal website is greenslug.com, and again, slug is spelled with 2 G's. And you can find my Medium account through For the New Christian Intellectual under the author GS Muse. So it's g.s.muse. And I also have other places on social media that you can find me as well, and I'm sure Cody will link that in the description box.
Yeah, that article that Greg is referencing is Rethinking Poverty and Charity, Better Ways to Help the Poor, or something about ways to help the poor and the least of these.
Here, I'll read it real quick. So the article is Rethinking Poverty and Charity, Better Ways to Help the Poor and the Least of These. And my follow-up article later on, when I actually get to writing it, I'm also working on a book and a short story and a rather in-depth documentary on geology and Noah's flood right now. So I've got a lot of projects going on in addition to working in a research lab. Thank God I'm finally in a microbiology lab playing with little creepy little organisms all day, and I love it. I love every moment of it. But so I've got a lot of projects going on, guys, but the follow-up article will be about evangelism in the 21st century. And I think there's a lot that we could do with that. I'm going to be talking about getting back to the gospel, getting back to what the Bible actually says about the gospel, versus all of these weird things that people have associated with the gospel, for better or for worse. And also talking about better ways to spread the gospel and to evangelize the whole world. So definitely stay tuned for that. It's definitely going to be something good.
I can see how that's going to tie in with this article, because people have holistic needs, their bodies, their souls. So wonderful. Keep up the good work, Greg. Thank you for doing that. And I'll look forward to having our next conversation sometime soon.
Actually, one more thing. So one more thing before we close out. I kind of touched on it, but honestly, I would really appreciate it if over the next few decades, the people who start the new Apples and the new Googles and all of these new Fortune 500 companies, if we could have more Christians owning businesses and more Christians involved in the economy, that would be wonderful. I mean, so often as Christians, we have this idea in our head that money is bad. And we'll say, oh yeah, I know the Bible does not say money is the root of all evil, or I know it's, the love of money is a root of all kinds of evils. And it's like, yes, there can be an unhealthy love of money, but the Bible does say a lot of good things about money. It says a lot of good things about owning wealth. It praises the woman in Proverbs, the wise woman who, not the wise woman, I want to say it's Proverbs 31. She has her own business. The Proverbs 31 woman, watch me totally get that wrong. Cody's shaking his head yes, but watch me totally get that wrong anyway, and it's a totally different chapter. Sorry guys, we didn't plan this out as much, otherwise I would have had numbers and Bible verses all written out here. The Proverbs 31 woman owned her own business, and she did amazing things. She clothed her family, I think, in scarlet. Her kids were warm. I think she laughed at the snow. I'm butchering the whole thing, I'm sure. Cody's giving me thumbs up, so I guess we'll both go down as heretics together. Money is not bad. Making money is not bad. If money becomes your god, that's bad. But honestly, if you want to say, hey, I want to serve God and not money, therefore let me not go be a business owner, it's like, hey, you're going and working for 40 hours a week for another guy. You are serving money. whether you like it or not, you are serving money. Maybe consider being a business owner if that's something you have a passion for. Money is not a dirty thing. It's a wonderful, beautiful thing that God created. Just like sex, just like pride, there's good pride and bad pride. There's good sex and bad sex. There's good. We talk here about the New Christian Intellectual about good selfishness and bad selfishness. and you'll have to stay tuned. You have to check out some of our other videos for that. So there's a lot of things out there. It's like, if money is in its proper place, just like if the fire is in its fireplace and the chicken is in the pot, and if things are where they belong in your life, you're going to have a good life. Things are going to be better. So consider that. Consider becoming the next Steve Jobs. Consider becoming the next Bill Gates. And by the way, you want us to talk about the rich creating wealth and not deserving wealth? Bill Gates, J.K. Rowling, these people got rich because they made other people's lives better. Whatever shady business they might have had on the side, we'll kind of ignore that for the moment. Go make people rich. Go make yourself rich. Go make your family rich, and go do beautiful things for God, do beautiful things for yourself, and go do beautiful things for your fellow man. So I think that's what I got to say here.
Thank you, Greg. It's great talking with you today.
Likewise, Cody.